Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to our session, Best Practices for Migrating Your Desktop Pages to Mobile. I am Eugene Oxman, and I work on our mobile strategy, and I am joined by my sweatshirt twin, KK Ramamurthy, who is pretty much our rock star and appears in all of our webinars and other pieces of content that talk about this very topic. But before I really begin, since we have such an intimate audience, I would like to get to know you guys. Who here uses Salesforce 1? And who here has built a mobile SDK app? Okay, this is a typical breakdown. And we often see that our customers prefer to use Salesforce 1 for a lot of their needs. But they come across a certain challenge. How do you take all of your traditional Visualforce pages and make them accessible on Salesforce 1 in a way that your users are going to love to use? And sometimes it's not a very straightforward process because Visualforce was originally designed for the desktop, and now your users expect you to deliver a mobile-only pattern. In our agenda today, we're going to talk about this very topic, and we'll walk through a sample use case. KK is going to show you a lot of code since this is indeed a developer session. We'll talk about Lightning and style sheets and Salesforce Lightning Design Systems, and we'll leave some time for questions, so get them ready. And we're also joined by the mobile product manager marketing team over there, so if you have any other concerns, they're the people to talk to. A lot of what we talk about is already available, but some things are going to be forward-looking, and I just want to put the statement up here to tell you to make your purchasing decision based on products and features we already have out in the market. So let's get started. For the last 7 or so years, you've heard this message: don't take your existing desktop functionality and simply shrink it to a mobile device or shrink it to a tablet. Mobility is different. Everything's different about mobile devices. It's all about multi-touch interactions, instant gratification, always on, micro moments, making sure that your user is successful within 15 to 20 seconds. In fact, we know by data that most users spend at least 100 times on their phone a day, at least. And those are micro moment interactions. You pick up your phone out of your pocket, you get something done, and you go on your way. And taking desktop functionality that is designed for a large screen, designed for a mouse, designed for right clicks, doesn't always translate. And this is a lesson that we've learned ourselves, the way we've designed our products. Almost 4 years ago, we've launched Salesforce 1, and that was really the genesis for Lightning. This is how we started rethinking the overall Salesforce experience, and we made it mobile first. And over the last couple of years, we've started expanding that user interface and put it on a larger screen through Lightning. But as today, if you interact with Salesforce 1 and then you move to Lightning Desktop, you see a lot of similarities. You see the same look and feel. But the overall interaction model and the way you engage with the apps is totally different. And this is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. The way you can take your existing Visualforce pages or your existing desktop implementations and move them to mobile can be summarized in the following ways. First, you can use Lightning Design Systems. Lightning Design Systems, for the people that are familiar with HTML and JavaScript, is a set of CSS tokens. It's a way to consistently define the look and feel of your page. By following these tokens, you get this crisp, well-designed Lightning experience, but you don't necessarily need to make the full leap to Lightning. It's something that you can use today, even if you haven't activated Lightning. And we'll also talk about Lightning components. This is the core of our Lightning experience. These are low-level components that make it possible to create these multi-device responsive interfaces. And ultimately, that is the way you're going to be developing in the future. But today, because this is a step-by-step process, we don't expect everybody to make the jump right away. You have both options. So if you want to experiment, this is really a great way to do it. And for the people in the audience that haven't fully migrated to Lightning, the great thing about Salesforce 1 is that you could start developing with Lightning components right away. You don't need to go to Lightning Desktop in order to get that experience on your mobile device. So for a lot of developers, this is really a great way to introduce Lightning into their organization. Today, we'll be talking about a use case that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. You have an app, something like a timesheet. It's been built in Visualforce and works really well in Salesforce Classic. It works kind of well inside Lightning Desktop, but when you move to Salesforce 1, it just doesn't feel right. And you want to go through the process of making that design appealing to mobile users so they can follow the mantra. They can open up their phone, get whatever they need to get done, and be on their way. And to get started, I'm going to hand it over to KK, who's going to show you a lot of code and walk you through this process.
All right, so let's actually first see this Visualforce app in Classic, right? So you got this Visualforce app, it's approving timesheets, pretty straightforward, employee details, department, kind of launch show button, and then you might have something like a table view like this. Let's say if you want to go and look into the employee's timesheet, of course, multiple time entries in here. And then, this might even appear fine on a Lightning experience, right? So I just surfaced the same Visualforce page in Lightning experience. Of course, it's time of that year. Yeah, I'm a big Game of Thrones fan. So, and then, you go to the employee and the timesheets, all works fine, great. But let's see how this looks on Salesforce 1. So let me just minimize this for a minute. So in Salesforce 1, sorry? Yeah, right, exactly. Wait till you see the most of the code there, right? So let's say, you do a lookup, it kind of looks really small, grainy. Actually, in this case, it doesn't even load up fast. And then I go in here, it's not responsive, right? It doesn't look appealing to the users, it's all over the place, and it doesn't wrap through also. It's not responsive, it's not a great user experience. What you really want to give to your users, and I'll show you the final app, and then we'll walk through how to go and build it, right? So what you really want to give your users is something really responsive. I'm going to blame it on the Wi-Fi. All right, there we go. So something nice, right? It looks pleasing. You can also do your lookups. All looks great. Same look and feel how a typical standard Salesforce 1 app will provide. You also want to have that nice UI patterns, right? You are seeing some of the patterns in here like cards and icons and visually appealing and very clear on what the message is. And then they want to go and look at the timesheets. And as you see, the table doesn't look like a table here at all because it's a small form factor. It wraps into a nice column-based view, which is great. The buttons are great, scrolls well, and whatnot, okay? So what we are going to do is just in 8 steps, actually 7 steps, and then the 8th one is a bonus. In 8 steps, we are going to convert that old Visualforce page into a Lightning component and make it look like this. Make sense? Looks good? All right, so just want to make sure that you can see it. Can you guys in the last row say, okay, cool, all right. So step 1, first and foremost, if you want to have a Lightning component surface in Salesforce 1, there are basically 3 places it can be surfaced. One is on the left nav, so to speak, and I'll show it to you in a minute. And then one is on a quick action. And then you can also use a Lightning component within a Visualforce page and surface it wherever a Visualforce page can be used. In vast majority of the cases, you're going to do the first 2, which is basically either surface it on the left nav or you're going to surface it as a quick action, right? And for you to do that, for a Lightning component to be available on the left nav, you should have a couple of interfaces. When you create a Lightning component, say it is app hostable, which means it can be placed on the left nav. Available for all page types, makes it available in the Lightning app builder for your admins to drag and drop, all right? So that's important. Then force Lightning quick action. This interface is going to make sure that the Lightning component can be surfaced on a record layout, and I'll show it to you in a minute. And then action override. So if you have a standard button like a new or a edit or cancel or whatever that is, you can also override it with a Lightning component, okay? So this is a simple step 1 demo, and let's see how that looks on the device. Nothing earth-shattering, but basically it lets me show this component on the left nav. But if I also want to put it on a record, specific record layout, I can also do that. And as you see here, step 1 out here, and that actually launches the component, okay? So that's the first thing. Decide where you want to surface the component and make sure you use the right interfaces. Now, the next step is, remember, there were 3 screens in the UI that I showed, right? One is first screen where you get all the employee details. The second screen, which shows all the employees and their time. And then the third one shows the actual timesheet information of a specific employee. So we are going to treat this as 3 different components. And that's the beauty of Lightning components, where you don't have to build everything in one humongous app or a component. You can split them into smaller pieces and assemble them together. Think of them as Lego pieces in a big Lego whatever you build, right? And then you can reuse the same component wherever you want. It just doesn't have to be in this app. It can be used across multiple apps, right? So step 2 would be the first screen. It looks like there's a lot of code in here, but actually it's not, because you see that I've exploded the view here. So what I'm doing here is a couple of things. After I declared the interfaces, one thing I'm using here, you will see a lot of this in my code, and I will be publishing this in GitHub, and you can use it after this session. You see there's something called as a Lightning layout. That's a standard component that we provide, which uses what's called as a grid system. And that brings that responsiveness to the layout, right? Because when you are looking this in an iPhone, you want certain buttons to be positioned one below the other. But if you're looking at it in a tablet like an iPad, you want them to be spread across, right? And I'll show you an example of that also in a minute. So Lightning layout is a standard component that we provide you to basically build your UI, position your UI without you having to worry about where it goes. It will be responsive by itself. It uses a Lightning Design System classes by default, and you don't have to even invoke those classes. Just use Lightning layout, and whatever you put as Lightning layout item. For example, in this case, I put a Lightning layout item of certain size, and within that, I'm just using a label. And here is another interesting thing, force input field. What force input field does is it automatically brings in all that lookup, and you don't have to build that lookup from scratch. Just because I used force input field, now the lookup is already available to me. I don't have to code anything for the lookup fields. That goes for date fields, time fields, any record, any specific type of any specific field type that you put in Apex, or when you build your custom objects or even standard objects, force input field will take care of it. All right? So let's see, and so it's what, like maybe like 20 lines of code. So if I go and look at this if you go and look at this step 2 on Salesforce 1, you'll see this is the screen that was built based on like just 20 lines of code. I didn't have to do anything to position these screen elements, and even the lookup just works out of the box. Now, how does this look on a tablet device? So let's say I want to look at, I'm just going to go and make this as iPad. Let me make this landscape. And when I go and look at step 2 in here, now you see these 2 input fields are positioned on the sides because it knows the real estate is bigger on an iPad, and it will rearrange itself accordingly. All right? So you don't have to do anything at all. Just use Lightning layout and Lightning layout items. Everything is taken care for you. Let's build the third screen. And here is another pattern which is normally used. You will see it all over the place in native mobile apps, what we call as card layout. When you have multiple information and you want to group them into a simple card or a simple group, cards is the usual pattern that is used. And we have given a Lightning component for you to do that. So in this case, same concept, and I'm basically using a simple component called as Lightning card. I didn't have to do anything. All I have to do is call this component. There is an attribute called as action, and I'm putting a button there as an action, because when you tap on that button, you want to navigate to the next page, right? And then there is also the detail, right, where I'm surfacing the employee name, department. And here is another interesting component that I'm using, which is for the icons. And that will be in here. So it's a Lightning icon, and that should actually surface automatically when you bring that component in. Okay? So use Lightning icon, Lightning card, and Lightning button to bring in all that. Okay? How does this look? Let's see step 3. So I have go back as a button, which was the Lightning button, this one. This is the card, Lightning card. This is the Lightning card's action, where I'm going to wire a JavaScript to do what to do next. This is the Lightning icon. This is the name of the employee and whatever department, right? See, it nicely puts all this in a nice column view. You don't have to do anything in HTML. You don't have to do anything in CSS. Just use Lightning Card and all the other subset DOM elements, and it will position it for you. It also puts a nice grouped border so that it's clear for the user which specific record they are looking at. Make sense? All right. So let's see step 3. Actually, step 4. Step 4 is the third screen. This is an interesting thing, right? So in here, if you see the Visual Force page that was built, you had a big table. You might have used Apex data table to show the table and all the rows and whatnot. It's just not responsive, right? But I'm using the same table here. I'm not using the Apex table, but I'm using a HTML table. I didn't do anything new. All I did is I used table, but then I'm also using some classes in here, and these are all Lightning Design System classes. We have taken a lot of the hard work away from you. So all you need to do is use certain classes within those specific DOM elements, in this case table. And you will see there's one thing I've called out here, which is table stat. Just by calling that class, what happens is there is a media query which runs on the CSS, which basically says, if this table is displayed on a smaller real estate like an iPhone or an Android phone, it's going to stack the rows one below the other, right? Because you really don't want to show columns of tables, a table full of columns on a mobile device, right? On an iPhone. But if it's a tablet, then it's going to show it as a table, and I'll show that in a demo in a minute. Okay? So I didn't do anything more than just use a bunch of classes, and all of that is simple, straightforward HTML code. There is no standard table Lightning component because you don't need one. Just use a HTML table, but then apply the Lightning Design System classes. Okay? How does this look on mobile? Step 4. See, this is actually a table, but what you're seeing is each row is wrapped into a stacked column. But if I see the same thing on an iPad, see, it looks as a nice little table. Obviously, I made sure that I also show the wrapping. You can also apply a class called as SLDS truncate if you don't want to show everything wrapped. What it'll do is it'll put the text as much space it has and then leave it with 3 dots so that the user knows there is additional text. And on an iPad, it'll show like a table instead of stacking it as columns. Okay? So without you having to do anything at all of this is taken care. Great. So how does this all come together? So I created 3 components, step 2, step 3, and step 4. And all I did is I created one bigger component, which is step 5, and I'm calling those 3 components inside here. Right, as I said, right, these are all individual Lego blocks. So all I'm doing here is, this is the home component. Of course, the naming is different because I had to use a different one, but this is the first screen, this is the second screen, and this is the third screen. So we built 3 components, and now we are stitching all this together in one bigger component. Okay? Now, how does these 3 components interact with each other? So that's called as component events. There are 2 types of events, component events and application events. The difference is component events is if you use 3 components within a bigger component, those 3 components can talk to each other. In an application event, multiple components from different namespaces can talk to each other. Let's say Salesforce provides you a component, your vendor provides you a component, and you build a component. If all the 3 has to talk to each other, you can use application events if they're all in the same app. But if they are not in the same, if you have only 3 components in your namespace, you just use component events. Okay? How does that code look like? Very quickly. All I did was created a comp event here. Event is a type of a Lightning bundle. And I called it as timesheet component events. And then I have 3 attributes. It says show home, show employee list, show timesheet. So whenever a user presses the button, I just invoke this event, and the main component reacts to these events and does this whole handling all these components in the navigation. Let me quickly show you that code. So 3 components here, and if I go into the controller, all I am doing is hiding and showing based on which particular event was triggered by one of those components. Make sense? All right. So how does and just to look at the finished app with all the 3 components in here, step 5. All right, come on. All right, there we go. So all of this works. All this works, right? And when I click on, say, go back, what happens is an event gets triggered, which says, okay, the user wants to go back, and then the second component is shown, and the first component is, the second component is shown, and the third component is hidden. Similarly, when I hit go back, the second component is hidden, and then the first component shows up. Okay? Now, I don't know if you noticed something interesting in here. When I showed step 3 and step 4, the go back is a button on the top, right? But when the user scrolls, the go back disappears. So now if the user has to go back, they have to come all the way down and then hit go back. It's painful, right? So scrolling. Salesforce 1 handles scrolling a little bit differently. Okay, many times customers come and ask me like, hey, we have this Lightning component, it scrolls perfectly fine. It even scrolls great when we are launching it in a browser. But when we actually launch it in the Salesforce 1 app, it doesn't scroll properly. Why is that? And the reason is because we override the pull to refresh. When you're in Salesforce 1, and when you pull and leave it, it actually pulls down the screen and then refreshes. Technically, that's kind of a scroll action, right? When you're moving it with your thumb. So we override some of those. And when you are putting a scrollable content, it's not going to actually scroll. So how do we solve that? We have provided out-of-the-box component called as UI scroller. And all you need to do is UI scroll wrapper. This is a standard component. If you are facing a scrolling issue in your Lightning component in Salesforce 1, the simplest fix is put a UI scroller wrapper component. This is a standard component, and do all your coding within it. The UI scroll wrapper will take care of it. Okay? That's exactly what I did in step 6 here. I just brought in all my components in here and then put it in UI scroll wrapper. Let's see how it looks now when I go to step 6. Now you see the go back is actually kind of staked at the top, and it doesn't disappear. Okay? So UI scroll wrapper is a great choice, but it's always a but, right? Let me see how it looks on an iPad. We have a problem. Not because it's not scrolling, it's because you see this space in here. Because UI scroll wrapper can only take static height. So you can say, hey, put my content in a scroll wrapper, and my scroll wrapper is of height 600 pixels, which is exactly what I did here, which means that showed up really well in a Salesforce 1 mobile app, but when I went to iPad, it's still putting it at 600 pixels, leaving space in here. That's not a great user experience. So what I did, though, is a very simple, and I've published this in GitHub, and there is links at the end of this deck for that. I've created a custom scroll wrapper component, which basically uses the UI scroll wrapper, but it determines the screen width and height with simple JavaScript and applies the height accordingly. Okay? Go to GitHub. It's a very simple code. I don't want to go into details of that because it's going to take some time, but it's very simple code. You just use it, or just use that component in your developments. It should work fine. Okay? Now, when I used, so let's go to step 7. Now, I use the same scroller component. It looks great on iPhone, but when I look at an iPad, there you go. It looks good. Let me change this to portrait. hey, it looks good. It actually resizes itself. So that's a simple technique to dynamically put the height for your scroller component. Okay. Now, there's another issue I've seen usually customers come and tell us is like, hey, let me go back to the step 4. No, maybe step 3. So sometimes you want to use models, right? Like show some pop-up on the screen. So when I am going to tap this button which says show model, it's going to show me that pop-up. But guess what? Because I didn't have that scroll wrapper, the pop-up shows all the way up there, right? And users are like, what happened to my pop-up? It's just painful. Now the UI scroller also solves for that. So when you do that, what's happening is it's only scrolling the content. So the same thing when I say the model, it stays here, I scroll, shows here, stays here. Simple, straightforward, okay? All right, so let me quickly go through the 7 steps and I'll show you the 8th step also, which is interesting, at least for me. So we created smaller components. We created 3 components, right? We didn't create one big component. We created smaller components. Each of these components internally used standard Lightning components, right? I used Lightning button, Lightning icon, Lightning card. I used Lightning Design System styles to basically make my components responsive. I didn't use any CSS, none of that, right? I didn't even use JavaScript much for this because all the positioning, the styling, everything looks like a standard Salesforce app, right? Now, but you might be a customer who is very brand conscious. You might not like blue buttons. You might like green buttons. You might like pink buttons, whatever your preference is. Now, does it mean that you have to reinvent all of this? Actually not. There is a simple nifty technique. If you go to Lightning Design System, and then if you go to downloads, you can go and download the entire design system package, okay? And when you do that, what happens is you are going to get a file with a bunch of things, and there's going to be a nice little folder called as SCSS. There is a tool called as, so here is the thing with CSS. CSS doesn't take variables in the sense that you cannot dynamically change the CSS classes. Okay, everything is static. If you say this button needs to be of this color, you have to put the color code in it, right? There is a concept called as making dynamic style sheets, which is a tool called as SAS, SASS. Anybody has used SAS, less? Right. So what SAS does is it lets you write CSS as code using variables, and then you run it through this tool. It will chuck out a new CSS file for you, which is great. Now, which is what we want to use. We internally use those tools because we don't hard code anything, right? We basically use what we call tokens. For example, a button background color might be called as color background variable, and then there will be a hex color value for it. And when we run this through the SAS processor, it actually creates a CSS file with whatever that is, right? So what I'm going to do here is I go into this SAS tool, and then there is this nice little file called as index.scss. Okay? It has a bunch of things. Don't sweat it. I'm going to import a simple file called as override TDX demo, how original, right? So all that override is a simple SCSS file. And again, I'm not trying to teach you how SAS works. You can look it up. It's very easy. There are a bunch of tutorials available. But all I did is change the background button color into a totally different color scheme. Okay? And once I did that, so I went to index.scss. I included that override, and that override says change that particular token to a totally different color. And all I have to do is go and write a simple command like this, SAS index.scss to override.css, and then it's going to run for a minute. And once it does that, let me show you step 8, where I'm just calling that new CSS. So I loaded that CSS as a static resource, and I'm including it in my component. Moment I included that in my component, now the new tokens will be applied. So let's see how my step 8 is going to look like. See, the same button called a show changes from blue to whatever that color I chose. This show was a blue color before. Now this is changed globally across, right? Just to show you what it was. Let me show it to you here. Because I have not loaded that override here, you can still see that it is blue in color, right? But in here, but in the iPhone, it's a different color. So by a simple token, I just changed it. Now the best part is, if I go into step 3 in here, now, or step 2, now it's also changed there. A simple change to the token is going to change it across, right? So for brand conscious customers, you can use this. What is in the roadmap, and I believe it's already in developer preview, is instead of you having to wire all this and SCSS and whatnot, we are going to give a Lightning bundle where you can override your own tokens and default tokens. That's in the roadmap. But until then, if you really want to get your branding for all these buttons, you can do this trick. All right? So let's do a quick, we got 8 minutes. Let's do a quick review of what we saw. And this deck obviously will be shared with you. And it has got all the things that I talked about. I've documented it here. Okay. So Lightning Design System is your friend, right? Don't go and try to reinvent the wheel. If you want to write your own CSS files, great, but only do for smaller portions. You don't really need to, because if you want to really get your apps to your users fast, why reinvent the wheel? Just use what we already provide you. So if you have not tried out Lightning Design System, please do, because that's going to be important for Lightning experience also in the future for you, if you have not moved from Classic to Lightning, right? So the way I see it is, Salesforce One is awesome in the sense that it gives you a gateway to get ready to Lightning experience, if that's what you have in the future, because you can try out a lot of customizations in Salesforce One, roll it out to a smaller group, see how it works, and then plan for your Lightning experience, right? So that's one. So we talked about grid system, scaffolding system. It's brilliant. Use it with the Lightning layout components that we provide. But if you want to override certain behavior, or if you want to get absolute control, you can also use the classes for grid available in Lightning Design System. Okay? Cards. Use cards for, this is a pattern that is used in mobile development. Common theme, right? Use cards. Data tables. Use the SLDS table classes, tagged classes to kind of reformat the UI. Icons. I cannot say this enough. We have more than 200 icons available for you, right? And icons are very, very important in the mobile world. Visual cues are more important than all the text information, right? So icons, just use the Lightning icons component, and you'll be able to use more than 200 icons. And there are a bunch of utility classes available in Lightning Design System. For example, SLDS backdrop, and that's really useful because when you are doing something and you want to send a call to Apex and get data back, until then you'd want to prevent the user from tapping anything, you can just call SLDS backdrop clause, and it's going to put a kind of an invisible veil on top of the screen, right? But then you also want to show a spinner, because the user should know that like something is happening. So use the SLDS spinner to show the spinner. Okay? SLDS hide and SLDS show, it's very useful when you already have a bunch of elements rendered on the screen and you want to show and hide on demand. Truncate and wrap. Again, if you have long text, you can either wrap them or truncate them. So that's useful as well. We talked about design tokens. We provide tokens for less than SAS, but if you have to use one, use SAS, because that's what we use internally. So that would be our recommendation. So let's look at a couple of Lightning components best practices. 3 places to use. One, you can surface it on the left tab. You can surface it on quick actions. And you can also put it using Lightning Out, put it in a Visualforce page and surface that. The third one is not as clean as the other two, but it is still an available option while we provide Lightning component support in multiple places, right? In Lightning Experience, you can pull a Lightning component and put it in a record homepage, but in Salesforce One, you cannot do that yet. Okay, that's in the roadmap. But until then, if you have to surface a component in Salesforce One like this, you can, instead of having to write it as Visualforce page, write it as Lightning component, but put it in a Visualforce page using what we call as Lightning Out, where a vast majority of your development is in the component, but you're just using Visualforce as a nice little wrapper. And when we extend the support, you just take the Visualforce out and use the Lightning component directly. Static resources, this is something that catches customers by surprise sometimes, because if you are a web developer, you're so used to pull in static resources like style sheets and scripts from external resources, like from content delivery networks. But because of security reasons, we don't let you directly go to other side and pull those information. So if you want to use some JavaScript, third-party libraries, you have to load it into Salesforce using static resources. We saw a bunch of standard components, UI, Lightning, Force, Aura. There's a bunch of standard components. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We talked about events, how components can talk to each other. That's the preferred way. Oh, navigation. This comes back quite often because in a desktop world, usually developers go in and write a JavaScript code to say, when a user clicks this window.location so-and-so, and that works okay in desktop, but not going to work in Lightning and not going to work in Salesforce One. So use these utility classes to actually navigate back and forth. Okay, so there's a bunch of navigation components. Lightning Data Service is interesting because until, I think it is in beta now, which is you had to write an Apex controller for doing simple CRUD operations. If you have to go fetch a record, if you have to go edit a record, if you have to go delete a record, you had to write Apex controllers, but you don't have to do that anymore. Lightning Data Services does that for you. All you're doing is using a standard component from us, and then it'll take care of all the CRUD operations. And the best part is it also supports cache, which means performance will be, there'll be a high performance, right? It's not going to the server every time somebody is creating a record or deleting a record. It takes care of caching. It takes care of making sure if two multiple components are accessing it, it goes from the cache instead of having to go back to the server, which is great. Locker service. Locker service is a security model, and there are some surprises there. If you are a typical web developer and you are used to kind of absolutely own the page, there are certain limits that we put using Locker service. Don't be surprised, but there is enough documentation available. Make sure that your code is Locker service compliant, because going forward, that will be enforced very strictly, right? So this is just to provide that security layer, because JavaScript inherently, there are security complications there, okay? So Lightning CLI, this is the command line interface tool that we provide, because JavaScript in itself is kind of non-typed. It is not compiled, right, in the sense that it's not going to check for any code issues. It's not going to scream at you like, your code is incorrect. Unlike if you're an Apex developer, when you write wrong code and save it, if there is a syntax error, it's going to scream at you. But JavaScript doesn't do that. So you can use the CLI tool, which is the linting tool, and run through your controller classes, your JavaScript classes, and it will highlight things that are not either Locker service compatible or either ES6 compatible. It does a bunch of checks before you can get it to production, okay, as a best practice. Lightning Inspector is an awesome Chrome extension that lets you do performance, and we are running short on time, so I put in some resources. If you are looking at building, these are the 3 skill sets that you absolutely need, not just for Salesforce One, but just for any web development, and so does in Lightning world, Lightning experience world. Your Visualforce and Apex skills are great, but you also need to actually focus on these 3 skills. And there is whole set of course, Trailhead is awesome, so we have a whole bunch of Trailhead modules and some resources out here. Okay. Time was short, but I just wanted to actually show you a real code on how we build these things from a classic Visualforce page into a mobile renderable responsive page using Lightning components and Lightning Design System. With that, I think we have 15 seconds, so questions? Thank you. Yes? Correct. So Aura If is going to either render the component or not render the component, right? Which is the recommended approach. And I also you can use hide and show if the component, if you know that the DOM element has already been rendered and it's not going to go anywhere, then it's much easier for you to hide and show rather than recreating it, right? So I. Correct. Correct. Yes. The code sample I showed, pretty much everything is available now.
I did see you have an field that has a lookup, the employee name.
Yeah.
Basic is a lookup.
Yep.
But I don't think that's available right now. The lookup's not.
So if you use good, you caught that because I have an example for it. So let's see step 3, right? The way I influence the lookup is, no, was it step 2? Maybe step 2. Is using this force input field component. So when you use force input field, and if the underlying field is of type lookup, it is going to automatically wire this for you. So that's available. But, cutting time. Okay. So, yeah, but then you can use other components, and I'll talk to you after this because obviously being thrown out of the stage. But yeah, so there is a way to actually hook up your own custom component if you want more. Yeah. Let me catch up with you on that.